The phone lit up in the darkened room as if it had a mind of its own, casting pale, flickering shadows on the peeling wallpaper. No one had touched it. The house was silent except for the steady hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. From the bedroom came a faint whisper, so soft it was almost swallowed by the shadows themselves. It was her voice, hoarse, trembling, yet oddly measured. "Bring it back," she said. "They are waiting, and it is cold." The family had never heard her speak like this, not after the stroke, not after she had begun to lose her grasp on memory. They assumed it was the confusion, the fragments of words that did not belong to any sentence, the way she called her grandson by the wrong name, or asked repeatedly where the others were. They recorded these moments on their phones, convinced that her doctors might see something in them, something medical, a reason, an explanation. It was only later, after her death, that they understood the true weight of those recordings. In the beginning, her transformation was subtle. It began with the little things, a cup of tea poured and forgotten, a day planned and abandoned mid-morning, a sudden smile at someone who was not there. The family attributed it to aging, to the stroke, to the inexorable, slow unraveling that comes with years. But there was something different in her eyes, something calculating beneath the mist of forgetfulness. She remembered details that seemed impossible for someone with her condition. Tiny, inconsequential things at first, like which book she had lent to which neighbor, or how the wind shifted through the alley behind the house. She remembered the patterns of disappearance long before anyone else noticed them. Her language grew strange, distorted. She called her daughter by a name that sounded foreign and twisted her son's name into something unrecognizable. She spoke in fragments, but the fragments had a rhythm, a deliberate cadence that unsettled those around her. Sometimes she would pause mid-sentence, staring at the wall or the ceiling, and the pause felt loaded, pregnant with meaning that no one could yet interpret. They chalked it up to dementia, to the neurological residue of her stroke. But the phone recordings, kept carefully in a folder labeled medical notes, began to accumulate. At first, the family listened casually, as if going through a diary, but soon they noticed patterns. She mentioned dates, places, and events with a consistency that did not belong to someone losing their mind. The names were sometimes altered. John became John, Mary became Marie, but the actions, the details, the timing matched real events that had occurred in the town. Incidents that had quietly faded into the background of local newspapers. She spoke of people who would not wait, of steps in the dark, and returning when the air turned sharp. At night, when the recordings played, the family would sit in the living room, holding each other close, feeling the slow chill crawl along their spines. They laughed nervously at first, as if mocking themselves for being frightened, but the laughter died quickly when a phrase would repeat, exactly as it had days or weeks before, unchanging in tone and intent. As weeks passed, the consistency became undeniable. Each sentence, each fragment, each misnaming was a thread weaving a tapestry that revealed more than mere confusion. She spoke of doors left open, of shadows that lingered too long, of voices that did not belong. The first time one of them realized what she had been saying, it was almost by accident. They had played back a recording from 3 months prior, a seemingly meaningless fragment. "He wears the coat, the wind knows where." Only then did it click. The man she spoke of had vanished nearly a year ago, reported missing in the local newspaper, and the description of his clothing, his habits, and even the angle of his favorite chair in the living room matched her words precisely. Fear settled like dust in the corners of the house, but curiosity, as it often does, outweighed caution. The family began to listen more deliberately, piecing together the fragments, noting patterns, recording repetitions. The recordings were no longer a medical curiosity. They were a map of events, of people, of disappearances. They began to notice the subtle cues in her speech, a pause before a name, a deliberate emphasis on certain words, a shift in tone when she mentioned locations. It was as if she were speaking in code, a code only fully understandable when the listener was willing to confront the possibility that the mundane, loving grandmother they had known was something entirely different. There were nights when the family would hear her voice emanating from the phone in empty rooms, asking questions that had no clear referent. Why is he still here? Has he returned yet? Are they counting properly? The words were innocuous enough to pass as the ramblings of someone who had lost her mind. Yet the more they listened, the more the pattern emerged. Each question corresponded to someone in the town who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. She was reciting, documenting, verifying. One evening, the eldest grandson, Daniel, sat alone in the bedroom, headphones on, the phone cradled in his hands like a relic. The recording played a simple phrase repeated thrice, each repetition slightly slower, each word articulated with precision. She waits. She waits. She waits. The cadence was deliberate, almost ritualistic. Daniel shivered as he realized that this was not the voice of a woman losing her mind, but of a meticulous chronicler, someone cataloging events with unerring accuracy. The family tried to rationalize it. Perhaps she had overheard rumors. Perhaps she had knowledge they did not. Perhaps it was coincidence. But coincidences stacked like dominoes, forming an unbroken chain. And in that chain, there was an unmistakable logic, a careful orchestration that no random mind could maintain. She had a memory, yes, but not the kind anyone would expect. She remembered patterns in people, in time, in disappearance. She cataloged them like a ledger, reciting them aloud in the guise of confusion, hiding the meticulous order behind the mask of illness. As winter approached, the recordings took on a new urgency. She began to speak of cold nights, of waiting in alleys, of doors that should remain closed, of shadows moving against the wind. The family started noticing that certain sentences she had uttered months before now sounded like instructions, warnings, or perhaps confessions. One night, while listening to a particularly long recording, the granddaughter, Anna, noticed a name, a man who had disappeared nearly 2 decades ago. The description was vivid, frighteningly exact, and the sentence ended with a whisper, "He should not have stayed." No one spoke about it at first, each consumed by their own dread. Yet the recordings began to dominate their lives. They would wake up at odd hours, drawn to the phone, compelled to replay each fragment, trying to decode what the elderly woman had been trying to say all along. And with each playback, the reality became more terrifying. She had not been confused. She had been documenting, observing, perhaps even judging. Her dementia had been a veil, a cloak under which she hid a terrible, precise intelligence. Daniel began to feel watched, though he knew it was impossible. The house felt heavier, darker, as if the walls themselves remembered her actions, remembered the things she had cataloged. Every creak, every sigh of wind through the cracked windows, every distant footstep in the snow outside seemed laden with significance. She had left behind more than memories. She had left a trail, a record, a warning that was almost too late to interpret. And then the recordings began to change. At first they had been passive, documenting events long past. But now there was an immediacy, a tense anticipation in her voice. She spoke as though events were unfolding, as though she were watching and guiding something that was still in motion. "He has lingered," she said in one fragment. "Too long. The wind knows. They know." The deliberate nature of her speech, the rhythm, the pauses, all suggested she was aware, always aware, of more than anyone could comprehend. The family could no longer ignore the reality. She had not been losing her mind. She had been hiding it. The gentle grandmother who baked pies, who told stories by the fireplace, who smiled warmly at her grandchildren, had been methodical, calculating, and observant. Her dementia had been a ruse, her slip of the tongue a camouflage, her pauses coded messages. And now, after her death, those codes remained, waiting to be deciphered, holding the family in a grip of horror they could not escape. Even after the funeral, the phone continued to illuminate, recording fragments in the dark, fragments that made no sense until they were pieced together with others. And as the family sat in the empty house, shivering from the cold and from fear, they realized that the grandmother they had loved, the one who had once knit scarves for them on winter nights, had never truly left. She lingered in the words, in the cadence, in the pauses. And in the final recording, the one that would shatter their illusions completely, she named someone still alive. Daniel pressed play, heart hammering. The voice was calm, clear, deliberate. "Why is he still here?" it asked. Not a question from confusion, but from expectation, from judgment. And in that moment, the full weight of what they had ignored, what they had called dementia, descended upon them. The grandmother had been cataloging, observing, deciding, and now the last fragment was directed not at the absent, not at the past, but at the present. Someone in the room, someone listening, was the subject of her scrutiny. And then silence. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, and for the first time, Daniel felt that the darkness itself was aware, waiting for the answer, waiting for the acknowledgement that the grandmother's work was not done. The house had become unbearably quiet after her passing, but the silence was deceptive. Every corner seemed to hum with memory. Every shadow felt like a presence. Daniel could not sleep. He found himself wandering from room to room, the phone clutched tightly in his hand, playing back recordings over and over, trying to decipher the patterns he still barely understood. He could feel her watching through every syllable, every pause, every deliberate misnaming. She had hidden herself behind dementia, but now her mind was unleashed in the recordings, revealing a methodical, terrifying intelligence that no one had anticipated. The first realization that she had been more than she appeared came when Anna, his younger sister, insisted on cataloging all the recordings. She created spreadsheets, cross-referencing dates, places, and people. At first, it seemed like a morbid academic exercise, a way to process grief. But soon, the pattern became undeniable. Her words had not been random. She had been documenting, not incidents of the past alone, but people who had vanished quietly over the decades, people who had been reported missing only in brief newspaper notices. The names were twisted, altered slightly, but the details were precise. Clothing, habits, even the way someone walked, all recorded in her voice with unerring clarity. She knew, Anna whispered one evening, her eyes wide and hollow. She knew everything, every disappearance, every time someone vanished, and she was writing it all down, talking it out like a diary we never understood. Daniel shivered, listening to a recording where the grandmother described a man walking through the market, noting the angle of his coat, the rhythm of his steps, and the way he paused near a lamppost. The man had disappeared a month later. The description matched perfectly. The horror in Daniel's chest tightened. He realized she had been watching, cataloging, anticipating. Night after night, the recordings grew darker. She spoke of shadows that lingered too long, of footsteps that did not belong, of doors left open to allow things in and out. There were phrases that made no sense in isolation. The wind counts them. Do not leave him. The cold remembers where they hide. The family initially laughed nervously, calling them metaphorical, imagining an old woman talking nonsense. But the humor faded quickly when they realized that every phrase corresponded to someone who had disappeared, often with no trace at all. It was Daniel who first connected the idea that these were not confessions of a dementia-addled mind, but deliberate, coded records of her actions. He went back to the earliest recordings, the ones made months after her stroke. She had been repeating names, locations, descriptions of patterns, and asking questions. Did they wait? Are they counted? Where is he? Each phrase seemed like an innocent query, but placed in context, it was a record of people who had been removed quietly from the world, catalogued as if she were keeping meticulous notes. The terror came slowly, creeping into the corners of the mind. The grandmother who had baked pies, who had knitted scarves, who had told bedtime stories, had been watching people die for decades. And the more the family listened, the more they realized that she had taught them to see life in patterns, to recognize absence and presence, and that she had been practicing something they had only begun to comprehend. One night, Daniel found an old photograph hidden in a drawer. It was a picture of his grandmother as a young woman, smiling at the camera, arms around two other women. At first, it seemed harmless, an ordinary snapshot, but there was something unsettling. In the background, half hidden by shadows, were shapes, people who did not belong, faces twisted in quiet horror, staring directly at the camera as if they knew they were being watched. It was impossible, and yet undeniable. The following recording shed light on the photograph. She spoke of people in houses, of visitors who stayed too long, of those who lingered where they should not. The descriptions matched the photograph, even the subtle details. The way someone held a cup, the way someone leaned against a wall. Daniel felt his stomach twist as he realized that these were the first victims, perhaps of a careful, hidden pattern. She had documented them not only in memory but in photographs, in words, and now, even after her death, her presence lingered in the recordings like a spectral ledger. The family began to notice the signs, small, almost imperceptible things. A coat left in the wrong place, a chair moved slightly from its usual angle, a whisper of wind through a cracked window. Each seemed mundane, but when cross-referenced with her recordings, the patterns became horrifyingly clear. She had prepared the house, her world, for her absence, leaving behind a trail that now demanded attention. Daniel and Anna decided to investigate further, retracing the steps mentioned in the recordings. They walked through the town, noting alleys, abandoned buildings, and houses where she had spoken of people lingering too long. The details matched almost perfectly. There were old newspaper clippings tucked into books in the library, reports of disappearances decades old. Every description she had made, every voice she had mimicked, every fragment of phrase now formed a coherent, terrifying map. It was in the attic that they found the most chilling evidence: dust-covered boxes, filled with notebooks, photographs, and small personal items belonging to people who had vanished. There were careful records, dates written in neat handwriting, brief descriptions, sometimes as simple as, "He waited too long," or "She forgot the door." The collection was vast, spanning decades. And yet, even in the meticulous detail, there was a cold, unerring precision that sent chills down their spines. She had documented not only her own actions, but the timing of others, the way the world had responded, the way they had vanished without notice. The recordings and the documents together painted a picture so horrifying that Daniel and Anna could barely comprehend it. Their grandmother, the woman who had nurtured them, had been methodical in her killings, careful, almost surgical. And yet she had hidden it behind the guise of aging, of forgetfulness, of dementia. Every pause, every misnaming, every fragment of sentence was a deliberate obfuscation, a code meant to confuse, protect, and perhaps delight in the secret knowledge of her deeds. One evening, As winter set in and the wind rattled the windows, Daniel replayed a recording that had haunted him for weeks. She spoke of someone still alive, someone who lingered beyond what she deemed appropriate. The tone was calm, almost curious, yet heavy with expectation. Why is he still here? The question was directed not at the absent, but at the present, at those listening, at the family themselves. The realization hit Daniel like a wave of ice. She had been observing them, her legacy of horror extending beyond her death. The shadows in the attic seemed to shift as he listened, as if acknowledging the question. The notebooks, the photographs, the recordings, all were extensions of her consciousness, waiting for the family to decipher the final piece. And in that moment, Daniel understood the full scale of what they had inherited. Not merely a house or memories, but the continuation of her observation, her judgment, her control. The fear became palpable. Every sound in the house was amplified. Every creak, every draft of air, every distant step outside was laden with meaning. They could no longer ignore the recordings, nor the notebooks. Each day they pieced together the fragments of her life, uncovering not only her actions, but her philosophy, a meticulous chronicling of absence and presence, a study of patterns, a record of life and death hidden in plain sight. And then, one night, they found the final set of recordings, the ones she had made in the days just before her death. They were different from the others, deliberate, measured, almost ceremonial in tone. She spoke of someone still among the living, someone who had evaded the ledger, someone whose time had not yet come. He has lingered too long, she said, and now it is my turn to see. The words sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. It was impossible to ignore. The grandmother who had seemed fragile, who had been thought to be losing her mind, had been in complete control until the very end. And now, through the recordings, through the shadows of the house, she was still present, still judging, still waiting. The family was trapped not only in grief, but in terror, forced to reckon with the reality that she had planned everything meticulously, and that her influence did not end with death. Daniel could no longer ignore the sense that the house itself was alive with her presence. Each night, when he lay in bed, he felt the walls pressing closer, the shadows stretching, and the faint echo of her voice weaving through the air like smoke. Anna, too, had begun to act strangely, speaking less, her eyes darting to corners where nothing stood. They both understood, without speaking, that the grandmother they had mourned was not gone. She lingered, in the house, in the recordings, in the notebooks, and most terrifyingly, in the logic of her own design. They began to retrace the steps detailed in the recordings more systematically. Every alley, every abandoned building, every old market stall she had mentioned became a location to investigate. It was as though she had left a trail not only of information, but of her own twisted satisfaction. They discovered small, hidden spaces in basements and attics, places where things had been stashed, old watches, frayed coats, shoes that did not match any surviving owner. Daniel shuddered at the thought that each object belonged to someone who had vanished quietly, meticulously erased from the world. One notebook, bound in faded leather and smelling faintly of lavender, contained lists, names, dates, short descriptions, each followed by a simple symbol, a check mark, a dash, or a cross. At first, Daniel thought it might be random, but cross-referencing with the local archives revealed the terrifying truth. Each mark corresponded to a disappearance, a death, or a life she had controlled. The check marks were victims she had confirmed gone. The dashes were those she had observed but left alone. And the crosses, those were the ones who had lingered, those who had survived beyond what she deemed acceptable. Anna flipped through the pages silently, her hands shaking. She was not just killing people, she whispered. She was cataloging them, watching them, deciding who belonged and who did not. Daniel nodded, feeling the weight of it settle in his chest. She had been a master of observation, patience, and timing. The family's perception of her as frail, forgetful, and sweet had been a facade, carefully constructed over decades. Every lull in her voice, every stumble in her words, every misnaming in the recordings had been deliberate, a coded language that concealed a mind more precise and terrifying than they could have imagined. The deeper they delved, the more unsettling the details became. There were entries describing people they knew, distant relatives, neighbors, friends of the family. Some were noted as gone, others as watchful, and the most chilling category, marked with a cross, included the living. And one name stood out, a name they both knew. Daniel's hands trembled as he read it aloud. He lingers, too long, must be observed. The recognition hit them simultaneously. It was him. He had been the one listening to the recordings, piecing together her history, and now he realized that the grandmother had already included him in her ledger. Not by mistake, not by chance. She had anticipated him, tracked him, cataloged him. They tried to leave the house, to escape the suffocating atmosphere, but every exit felt wrong, as if the walls themselves had shifted. The front door, once familiar, seemed smaller, narrower, the hallway longer and twisting in ways that defied memory. They felt her presence in every corner, in every shadow, and each whisper on the recordings now seemed like a direct command. He is still here. He lingers. The town around them began to feel unreal. Streets they had walked 1,000 times now seemed like corridors in a labyrinth. Every face in the crowd felt loaded with significance, every passerby a potential subject of her judgment. Daniel began to notice patterns he had missed before. Someone who walked in a certain rhythm, a hand gesture repeated by strangers. Even the way the wind blew through the streets seemed deliberate, as if orchestrated to echo her observations. One evening, they returned to the attic to examine the notebooks once more. Daniel lifted a box from the corner, revealing a bundle of letters tied with a frayed ribbon. The letters were addressed to no one, written in her precise handwriting. At first glance, they seemed mundane, filled with reminiscences, advice, and trivial details. But as he read, the pattern became clear. She had documented her intentions, her assessments of people, her calculations. In one letter, she described a neighbor in painstaking detail, noting habits, weaknesses, routines, and a final judgment: too careless, must be corrected. The gravity of her meticulousness pressed down on them. She had not acted haphazardly. Each disappearance, each death, each record of observation had been planned and executed with precision. And now, in death, she continued to observe, through the recordings, through the legacy she had left behind, and through the meticulous notes that formed a silent yet unyielding map of control. The final recordings they found were the most chilling of all. She spoke of someone still alive, someone who had eluded her grasp, and the tone was neither frantic nor confused. It was deliberate, expectant, almost ritualistic. He lingers, she said, and I must see. The emphasis on the last word made Daniel's blood run cold. It was not a memory she was recounting. It was an instruction, a statement of intent, and a declaration that her influence extended beyond the grave. Anna shivered. She knew we would find this, she said. She wanted us to know. She wanted us to see it. Daniel could only nod, the phone heavy in his hands. They understood the terrifying scale of what they were dealing with. Their grandmother had not been merely a woman of advanced age, struggling with memory. She had been a master of patience, observation, and calculation, hiding her true nature behind the guise of frailty. Every smile, every pie she baked, every bedtime story had been a mask, and now Her legacy was theirs to confront. The shadows in the attic seemed to grow longer as the evening deepened. Daniel and Anna sat in silence, listening to the wind, listening to the creaks of the old house, and listening to the final recordings. Every whisper, every deliberate pause, every carefully chosen word seemed alive, as if the grandmother herself were present, evaluating, judging, and waiting. It was then that Daniel understood the most horrifying truth. The grandmother had anticipated their curiosity, their need to understand, and she had built her legacy so that they could not simply leave. She had drawn them into the web, woven from years of observation and meticulous record-keeping, and now they were part of her design. There was no escape. She had accounted for their arrival, their investigation, their inevitable terror. As they sat in the attic, a faint creak came from above. The attic ceiling itself seemed to shift. Daniel and Anna froze. The sound was subtle but deliberate, a rhythm that matched a phrase she had repeated in the recordings. Too long. Too long. They understood immediately. She had been preparing them for this moment, training them with her recordings, her notes, and her silence. And now they were ready to confront what she had left behind, to face the culmination of her life's work. It was a terrifying realization. The grandmother, whom they had thought frail and weak, had been orchestrating events with precision, using patience and observation as her instruments. Her recordings were more than memories. They were instructions, assessments, and judgments. And the most terrifying aspect of all was the one name she had marked as lingering, the one individual still alive, Daniel. The wind rattled the windows as he replayed the final phrase. Why is he still here? The words were calm, clear, and precise, yet they carried an unbearable weight. They were neither a question nor a request. They were a command, an assertion of control, a reminder that she remained present, watching, and judging. Daniel's heart pounded as he realized the full scale of her influence. She had planned not only her actions, but the aftermath, the discovery, and the terror that would grip her family long after she was gone. Daniel's hands trembled as he held the phone, the last recording playing in the dim light of the attic. Anna sat beside him, frozen, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The wind rattled the windows, carrying with it an icy draft that seemed almost purposeful, as if the house itself were breathing. Her voice echoed clearly from the speaker, calm, deliberate, unrelenting. Why is he still here? The question was no longer abstract. It was a confrontation. Daniel realized with a cold surge of terror that she had been watching him all along, even in death. Every note she had taken, every recording she had made, every pause and misnaming had been a trap, a guide, and a test. And now, through the artifacts of her life, she was passing judgment. Anna's voice was barely a whisper. It's you, Daniel. She's focused on you. She shivered, pressing her hands to her mouth as if to muffle her own breathing. The realization settled over them like a physical weight. The grandmother they had thought frail and forgetful had orchestrated everything, even this confrontation. She had engineered the legacy of terror to ensnare them, to extend her reach beyond the grave. Daniel's mind raced. The notebooks, the photographs, the recordings, all were part of a design so meticulous that it seemed impossible for a human mind to conceive. She had anticipated every move, every reaction, every investigation. She had cataloged them, tested them, prepared them. And now, her judgment hung over him like a shadow that refused to lift. He stood slowly, stepping back from the phone, feeling the weight of her gaze in every corner of the attic. The walls seemed to lean inward, narrowing the space, and the shadows shifted as though alive. Daniel could hear it, subtle creaks, faint whispers, the almost imperceptible sound of movement in the darkness. She had never truly left. The notebooks called to him. He reached for one, opening it carefully, and the pages seemed to breathe in the dim light. Names, dates, locations, all meticulously recorded. And then he saw it, a cross marked next to his own name. His stomach twisted. She had been preparing for him, even in death. The cross signified lingering, observation, judgment. He was the one she had not yet claimed, but whose time she had deemed overdue. Anna's voice broke the silence. "Daniel, we need to leave, now." But the house felt wrong. The front door, the staircase, the familiar hallway, all seemed altered, as if the house itself resisted their escape. Every step they took was heavier than the last, the air thick with the presence of someone who had been there all along, waiting, orchestrating, anticipating. Daniel turned to her. "We can't not just run. We have to understand. We have to see this through." The words sounded hollow even to him, but he could not deny the pull of the recordings, the notebooks, the legacy she had left. They had to confront it, or they would be haunted forever. He played the recording again, listening carefully to every word, every pause, every inflection. "He lingers," she had said. "Too long." Daniel realized that this was not a statement of confusion, but of instruction. He was meant to feel her presence, to understand her power, to recognize that she had controlled not only life and death, but memory, perception, and fear itself. The shadows deepened. A cold draft swept through the attic, lifting the edges of pages, moving the notebook slightly as though touched by invisible hands. Daniel and Anna froze, hearts hammering. The voice on the recording repeated, slower this time. "He lingers. He waits. Must be seen." It was a cadence, a rhythm, a command. She had designed it this way, anticipating that her words would haunt them, that her presence would feel alive. Daniel's mind turned to the photograph they had found earlier, the one with the hidden faces in the background. He realized with a shiver that the photograph was not simply a memory, but a map, a record of observation that extended across time. She had documented everything, the vanished, the witnesses, the family, the patterns of their lives. And now, she was completing the map, bringing them to the point where they would understand the full scope of her design. Anna reached out, trembling, and Daniel took her hand. They both understood that the attic, the notebooks, the recordings, all were part of a continuum, a final lesson in the precision and patience of her mind. She had prepared them for this revelation, had woven it into every detail of their lives, every moment they had overlooked, every fragment of conversation they had dismissed. The realization was crushing. Their grandmother had been a master of patience, observation, and control. She had hidden her actions behind the veil of dementia, manipulating the perception of everyone around her for decades. Every disappearance, every death, every shadow and creak in the house had been part of her orchestration. And now, even in death, she continued to assert her influence, her judgment, her power. Daniel flipped through the notebooks once more, searching for any clue, any instruction, any message that might offer a way forward. His eyes fell upon a final entry, dated just days before her death. It was simple, almost innocuous in its phrasing, but the meaning was unmistakable. "The one who lingers must understand. Observation completes the work. Judgment is patience." The words settled over him like ice. She had anticipated everything, controlled everything, and now she demanded comprehension, acknowledgement, and perhaps complicity. They were not merely observers of her legacy, they were participants, unwilling or unwillingly drawn into the web she had spun. The wind rattled the windows again, louder this time, carrying with it a faint whisper, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. Do not leave. The work is not done. Daniel and Anna froze. The house had become a living extension of her mind, and they understood that the recordings, the notebooks, and the shadows were tools of her continued presence. Daniel's hands shook as he placed the notebook down. The realization hit with full force. She had never intended to leave them untouched by her actions. The grandmother, who had seemed frail and forgetful, had been deliberate, patient, and meticulous. And now her final act was to draw them into the orbit of her design. And then a sound, a step, soft, deliberate, coming from the hallway outside the attic door. Daniel's heart leapt. He looked at Anna, whose face was pale and drawn. Neither moved. The step came again, then another, and the air seemed to thicken, charged with anticipation. The door creaked open, slowly, almost imperceptibly, and the shadows shifted. Daniel understood before he saw it that it was not her body, not a physical presence, but the manifestation of her design, her observation, her control. Every step, every shadow, every whisper in the recordings had led to this moment. She had orchestrated not only her own life and death, but the awakening of fear, the imprinting of her presence, and the preparation of judgment for those who had survived her. The final recording played once more, her voice calm, deliberate, and filled with authority. He has lingered. Now he sees. Observation completes the work. Daniel felt a cold realization settle in. She had prepared them for this, trained them through recordings, shadows, and notebooks, and now she demanded acknowledgement, understanding, and perhaps complicity. The wind howled through the broken windows, the shadows deepened, and the attic seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Daniel and Anna sat frozen, realizing that their grandmother's presence was not bound by life or death. She had extended herself through meticulous observation, through coded recordings, to the legacy of her actions. And now she continued to assert control, waiting for the final acknowledgement, the final recognition, the final completion of her work. Daniel whispered, almost involuntarily, "We see you." The response was not in words, but in the shift of the shadows, in the subtle movement of the notebooks, in the sudden stillness of the wind. It was the acknowledgement he had feared, the completion of the web she had spun, the final act of control. And in that silence, Daniel understood the ultimate truth. She had always been in control, always observing, always judging, and now, even in death, her work continued, extending beyond the grave, beyond perception, beyond fear itself. The attic seemed to close around them. The shadows deepened, and for a moment, Daniel felt the presence of his grandmother as vividly as if she stood before him. Every lesson, every observation, every hidden pattern in her life had led to this moment, and he realized, with a shiver that would never leave him, that her work was not done. She had claimed them, not through death, but through understanding, through acknowledgement, through the chilling realization that some legacies are beyond escape, beyond comprehension, beyond the boundaries of life itself. Daniel looked at Anna. She nodded, her face pale and solemn. They understood. They had been drawn into the orbit of her legacy, and there was no turning back. The grandmother they had loved, feared, and mourned had orchestrated everything with a patience and precision that defied imagination. And now, even in death, she remained, observing, judging, completing her work. The phone went silent. The shadows held their breath. The house waited. And Daniel understood that some presences, some legacies, some minds never truly depart.